I knew a bloke at school who had a wife and a mistress, and get this, they were both pregnant at the same time. You'd think that would be a rare, one in a million scenario, but not for this guy. He was living the kind of life most people would only dream of in a twisted fantasy. His wife, the one he was legally tied to, lived across the street from his mistress. And I'm not talking about some casual fling here. No, these two women were both expecting his child, and he was juggling them like it was the most natural thing in the world. He had the nerve to play both sides of the coin, and the best part was that neither of them had any idea what was going on. He would visit his wife during the day, playing the role of the perfect husband, loving, attentive, and supportive. Then, when she was out of the house, he'd sneak across the street to the mistress's place and play the role of the loving partner there too. The women never crossed paths, never suspected each other. And the kicker? They were both pregnant with his child at the same time. That's right, two women, both with his baby, just a few months apart. And here's where it gets even more crazy. The guy didn't even need to hide his tracks. He made sure to keep his movements casual enough that no one ever questioned him. Both women lived across the street from each other, and he was the bridge between them. It was almost too absurd to believe, but somehow he was making it work. He had the perfect system. One house for the wife, one for the mistress, both pregnancies progressing at the same time, and neither of them had a clue they were sharing the same man. In fact, I remember him talking about how he loved the excitement of the situation. There was something thrilling about knowing that both of them were carrying his child, each unaware of the other's existence. He talked about it like it was a challenge, a game he was winning. And to make it all even more unbelievable, it was all happening so casually that you'd almost forget what a mess it was. He had no shame about it, none at all. He was in control of both women, both situations, and he was handling it like a professional, balancing his life like a high-wire act. Honestly, when I first found out, I thought it was just some crazy rumor. There was no way this guy was actually pulling it off. But the more I saw, the more I realized that it wasn't a joke. This was his reality, and somehow he made it work. But there was something about it that didn't sit right with me. How could anyone live with that kind of deception? How could two women be so oblivious, living in the same neighborhood, both pregnant with the same man's child, and never suspect anything? I couldn't help but wonder how long he could keep it up. How long could he juggle two families without either of them figuring out what was really going on? It was a mess of lies, deception, and manipulation, but somehow it was all happening right in front of us. It felt like something you'd see in a twisted soap opera, not something that was playing out in real life. And while part of me was impressed by his audacity, I also knew that it wouldn't last forever. Sooner or later, the truth would come out. But for now, he was living in this bubble of denial, acting like he had it all figured out. The wife and the mistress, despite the fact that they were both unknowingly pregnant by the same man, became friends. Yes, you read that right. They met at a gynecologist appointment, a completely ordinary thing for most women, but for them, it turned into an unexpected and bizarre bond. It started innocently enough, just two pregnant women waiting for their checkups in the same office at the same time. The coincidence was strange, but they didn't think anything of it. After all, they had no reason to suspect they were connected by more than just their pregnancies. Their appointments seemed to overlap more often than not, and before long, they started running into each other regularly. It became a sort of routine for them. After their appointments, they grabbed lunch together. They swapped pregnancy stories, compared notes about what they were experiencing, talked about cravings, and the usual fears that come with being pregnant. They were both going through the same thing, but they had no idea they were going through it in parallel lives, bound together by the same man. Neither of them knew about the other. What was even more surreal was how easily they bonded over their shared experience. They were both in the same stage of pregnancy, both feeling the same aches and pains, both trying to navigate the emotional roller coaster that came with expecting a child. It wasn't long before they were actually looking forward to their lunch dates. They had become friends, if you could call it that, sharing a connection that neither of them fully understood, but it was comfortable. It was easy. They had no reason to doubt each other, no reason to suspect that they were both in the dark about the same man. They never questioned how it all worked. The idea that the same man had impregnated both of them had never even crossed their minds. They were too busy trying to survive the daily grind of pregnancy and life to think about anything else. But one day, everything started to fall apart. It wasn't some big confrontation or dramatic reveal. No, it was something as mundane as a car repair. The wife had an appointment that. How would you feel if your partner hid their affair for months or even years? Write in the comments that day, and her car was in the shop. So, she took her friend's car instead, thinking nothing of it. She'd borrowed it before, and it was no big deal. It wasn't until she was driving, lost in thought, that something strange began to nag at her. As she glanced at the rearview mirror, something about the car felt too familiar. She had seen it before, way too many times for it to just be a coincidence. It clicked. This wasn't just her friend's car. This was her boyfriend's car. The realization hit her like a freight train. She had been borrowing her boyfriend's car without even realizing it. The man who had been seeing both of them at the same time had somehow woven himself into their lives in a way that neither of them had suspected. She had been driving around in the very car that her boyfriend used to get to, and from both of their houses, completely unaware. It felt like a punch in the stomach. She couldn't believe what she was piecing together. How had she not noticed it before? How had she not seen the signs that everything wasn't as it seemed? Her mind started to race. The pieces were starting to fit together, and they didn't add up. The thought of it made her dizzy. She had been unknowingly in the same space as her boyfriend's other partner. Both of them living parallel lives, completely unaware of the other's existence until now. It wasn't a coincidence that they had become friends. It was fate, a cruel twist of fate that was slowly unraveling everything. As she drove, the reality of what was happening set in. She started crying, tears blurring her vision as the weight of the situation overwhelmed her. "That's my boyfriend's car," she said aloud to herself, choking on the words. She couldn't believe it. This was the moment where everything changed. This was the moment that would expose the lie. Everything she had been living in, a comfortable, if complicated, reality, was about to come crashing down. The truth, once hidden so carefully, was finally starting to surface. And it wasn't just her who was being deceived. It was her friend too. The woman she had been talking to for weeks, bonding with over the shared experience of pregnancy, was carrying the same man's child. It wasn't some innocent coincidence. It wasn't just two women sharing a moment of connection. They had been unknowingly living in the same world, woven together by a man who had played them both, using their shared experiences to keep them both in the dark. But now, the pieces were falling into place. The car, the appointments, the growing suspicion, everything was coming to light. And as she sat in the car, crying, everything felt like it was slipping away. Her relationship, her friendship with this woman, and even her sense of self. What had she been doing? What kind of person was she to not have seen this sooner? And that was when she made the decision. She had to tell her. She couldn't let this continue. The truth was too big, too complicated to ignore. She had to confront her friend and finally end the lie that had been slowly eating away at both of them. The revelation had turned their world upside down, and both women were struggling to come to terms with what they had just uncovered. The lies they had been living were too intricate to untangle in a single conversation, and neither of them knew where to start. They were both angry, hurt, and confused, but in their own strange way, they found comfort in each other's company. They had both been deceived by the same man, and now they were facing the consequences together. But things didn't just end there. No, life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. It wasn't until a few days later, when the wife was driving to lunch, that everything truly fell into place. The wife had borrowed her friend's car to get around, since her own was in the shop. It was a simple enough request, one that seemed innocent enough. But as she drove down the street, she couldn't shake this nagging feeling, like something wasn't quite right. She had seen this car before. She had driven it before. The familiarity of it hit her like a ton of bricks. She had been in this car before, many times, when she was with him. And that's when it all clicked. She slammed her hand onto the steering wheel, her heart pounding as the realization hit her like a freight train. "That's my boyfriend's car!" she cried out, unable to keep the shock and disbelief from escaping her lips. She had borrowed his car. The car that had been used to drive between her house and the mistress's place. The car that had unknowingly been the link between their two worlds. It was his car. She hadn't noticed it before, but now the pieces were falling into place. The man who had been living this double life, juggling two women across the street from each other, had been using the same car to travel between them. The impact of this realization hit her like a wave. It wasn't just that he had been seeing her best friend behind her back. It wasn't just that he had betrayed her in the most intimate way possible. It was that both of them had been living in parallel worlds, unaware of the other's existence, all the while sharing this one man who had manipulated them both. They had been living in the same neighborhood, breathing the same air, and yet they had been strangers, caught in the web of his lies. It was a sickening, twisted irony. She pulled over to the side of the road, tears welling up in her eyes. She couldn't even comprehend the enormity of the situation. She had been so close to the truth, so close to realizing it, but the pieces had been scattered just enough to keep her from seeing the full picture. But now she saw it, and there was no unseeing it. When she arrived at her friend's house for lunch, she was a wreck. She was trembling, her face pale from the shock of everything she had just discovered. Her friend, seeing her in this state, immediately knew something was wrong. The wife blurted it out, choking on the words. "That's his car! The car that you've been driving! It's his! It's his car!" Her friend's face shifted, confusion giving way to realization. It was the same car, the one that had been parked outside the mistress's apartment, the one she had seen him get into so many times. The truth had finally come crashing down on both of them, and in that moment, everything changed. For a few minutes, they both sat there, silent, the weight of the truth settling in. The depth of the betrayal was undeniable now. There was no more pretending, no more hiding from the reality of the situation. They had been deceived by the same man, and their friendship had been built on a foundation of lies. But now, there was nothing left to hide. After the shock wore off, the conversation took a darker turn. Neither of them knew what to do with the information they now had. The fact that they were both carrying his child seemed almost secondary at this point. What were they supposed to do now? Could they continue their friendship, knowing that they had both been played by the same man? Could they even trust each other after everything that had happened? But in the midst of all this confusion, one thing became clear. They couldn't stay in this limbo forever. They couldn't go on pretending that everything was fine, that nothing had changed. It was time to confront the truth and figure out what to do with the pieces that were left. And that's when the idea came up, something so bizarre, so twisted, that I couldn't believe it was real. But somehow, it worked. The three of them, him, The wife and the mistress ended up making an arrangement. They decided to live together, not in separate houses, not with the wife living across town and the mistress staying down the street. No, they moved into a duplex. The wife lived on one side and the mistress lived on the other. It wasn't a happy solution. It wasn't a clean solution, but it was the only solution they could come up with. They were all forced to live in this strange, warped version of their reality, where the man who had betrayed them both was still present, still weaving his web, still controlling the situation. The house was no longer a home. It was a prison, and they were all trapped in it, caught in a web of deceit, betrayal, and manipulation. The wife and mistress tried to navigate their new reality, trying to coexist under the same roof without tearing each other apart. They had no choice but to live in the same space, sharing the man who had broken their hearts. And the worst part? They did it. They made it work. They coexisted in this toxic, bizarre environment, one that none of them ever expected to be in. I couldn't help but watch this all unfold from a distance, trying to make sense of the madness. It was like watching a car wreck, a slow-motion disaster that couldn't be avoided. The whole situation was insane, but somehow it worked, sort of. The wife and mistress lived side by side, raising children that weren't even aware of the twisted web that connected them all. They lived in a duplex, with the wife on one side and the mistress on the other, and somehow they kept their lives going. In the end, I couldn't believe what I had witnessed. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I would have never believed it. It was a story so ridiculous, so insane, that it didn't feel real. But it was. It happened, and it left me with a permanent sense of disbelief about the lengths people will go to, the lies they will tell, and the consequences of those lies.